We are very happy to be joined today by Briahna Joy Gray, formerly of The Hill and currently, most importantly, host of the Bad Faith podcast, which everyone should subscribe to. Bri, it's always great to see you.
Always a pleasure, Krystal and Saagar.
Good to see you.
So I know you've told this story a number of times at this point, but I would really like you to go back a little bit. We played on our show the alleged eye-rolling incident, along with additional parts of that interview so people could get more of a fulsome sense of it and what you were dealing with there, which I thought was an impossible situation. But I'd love it if you could go back a little bit, because I think our audience is very interested in how these forces of censorship operate over time and the type of pressure that you've been under at The Hill, escalating post-October 7th, but even before that, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm glad you're focused there, because I do think that in the immediate aftermath of the firing and the kind of rationale that were presented for why it happened, the larger story of the fact that this has been going on for months and months, lighter versions of censorship, kind of the threat of the actual termination has been happening. So you're right, before October 7th, there were tensions, but most certainly after October 7th. We all know that Katie Halper was let go from The Hill over a year before October 7th for doing a radar in which she described Israel as an apartheid state and cited innumerable sources for that claim, including B'Tselem and other sources within Israel. And despite the fact that she's a Jewish woman citing Israeli sources for what is broadly considered to be a widely understood and accepted description in the international community, she was told that for non-ideological reasons, right? They claimed it was for non-ideological reasons, that there was something about the form, the style of her radar that wasn't up to The Hill's standards, and that meant that she could never appear on The Hill again, not just as a guest host, but in any capacity. So obviously that makes no sense at all. And for me, the writing was on the wall. And when Katie and I talked about what I should do afterward and how I should conduct myself on The Hill afterward, it was very clear that the only justification for me staying there was to be a sort of a test case and to continue to press those buttons, and particularly the one about coverage, critical coverage of Israel, until what we ultimately knew was going to happen actually did manifest, which is that censorship would come into effect. Mm-hmm. And after October 7th, I've mentioned this in other places, but I think it's really important to note, there were very clear instances of ideological censorship, for example, saying that Norm Finkelstein could not come on the show. And there were softer versions of censorship where frequently the language Israel block would be used to describe our Israel coverage for the day. The idea that all of the news that pertained to what was going on in Israel and Gaza could be confined to one segment out of 8 to 10 that were filmed in a day. And when I push back on that, saying we never describe it as like a Tucker Carlson block or a COVID block or a Joe Rogan block or an economy block or Joe Biden block, any other of the topics that we cover, if there's an appetite for it, we understand what the audience likes and we understand the news value and we'll weigh those things and decide how to proceed accordingly. They said, oh, no, we're not really talking about an Israel block, I swear. But again and again, that phraseology would come up and speaking of eye rolls, everybody in the room would roll their eyes whenever I proposed topics that were related to Gaza.
See, this is very interesting. And just so for clarity purposes, Hill has transferred ownership after Krystal and I left there. So some of this sounds familiar. Some of this is a little bit more explicit. So you're telling us, even though your name is behind you, it's like Rising with Briahna and Robbie, that they are explicitly programming and telling you who you can have on the show, who you can't have on the show, and explicitly defining blocks. Like, for example, people who are watching our show, those what we would refer to as blocks behind us. The only people who decide are Krystal, me, and the editorial team. But for you were actually being told and pigeonholed where things were. That's what was happening behind the scenes.
Part of the issue was that the editorial team had changed. So let's say 6 months ago, the end of last year, beginning of this year, we had a different producer who was lovely and supportive and really knew how to run a good show. And these problems existed more in terms of, Robbie and I would disagree on screen, but to the extent that whatever pressures from, higher up were filtering down, she did a really good job of sort of being the bulwark against that sort of editorial pressure. Eventually, though, that pressure became so great and the pressure on many staffers became so great that between January and the time that I left, everybody was basically either pushed out or fired. So there were legacy guys that worked in the control room, who did sound and tech that you two both know.
Oh, yeah.
That were there in January and were not there by the time that I left. We took a photograph in January when I think an intern was leaving, and Robbie and I remarked months later that 0 people in that photograph were still employed at the Hill, except for the 2 of us. So there was a big staff change that I think also made it so that the pressures were more acute, precisely because the new producer was hired. What they said was it was described as to have more editorial control over the show. I might not be phrasing that exactly, but more editorial input and to bring Rising in line with the Hill kind of writing side, more generally speaking, which, as you might remember, there's always been this tension between the Hill as a written news source and the tone of it and the very kind of opinion-driven show of Rising. And it always has felt like there was almost an embarrassment by the Hill to have this show that was successful, but very tonally different than the kind of news they put out over at the Hill. And it seemed like the more they ratcheted up their attempts to bring Rising into conformity at the same time that I think my coverage of Gaza and Israel became particularly a thorn in their side.
Well, some of those pieces, even though there's new management now, is very familiar to us. And, obviously we launched the show, Rising Saagar, and I am part of what was important to us in our worldview is we did position it as a place where you could have dissenting voices and opinions that weren't heard other places. And the Hill has sought both to profit off of that brand as a free speech platform, but also to corral you in particular, but obviously Katie Halper, I'm sure others as well, into what is actually, a comfortable lane for them. And, I think that's worth spelling out. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about how that operated and if there were other topics where you felt similar pressure, other guests that were similarly banned. But the other thing that I think is worth noting for people here is that, if you look at the Hill's channel, your segments on Israel were frequently some of the highest performers. So there was there were forces operating here. There was an upset here that went beyond, the quote unquote ratings, which from that perspective, your coverage was very successful. It was one of the things that people were most interested in hearing from Rising at this point in the show's history. So I'd love your sense of, okay, so where does that pressure come from? Did you face similar pressure on other issues, or was it really sort of unique to this one nation state and one conflict?
Yeah, I think that's such an important point because, look, you are obviously, you are the blueprint, right, for what we were doing. You know that it's a right-left show. There are obviously topics that you're more excited about, Krystal, from a leftist perspective, and Saagar more that you're excited about from a right-leaning perspective. And the same is true for us. And there are topics that, I'm not wild about talking about because frankly, as a leftist, I feel like there are distractions from the material issues that are more core to my political project. But I understand that it's a show and the audience has its own tastes. And I understand, even though I don't think it's maybe the most important thing in the world, if Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson are in a room together somewhere at Davos, then those are all the keywords that are going to light up the scoreboard and that we're going to cover it. It's not that big a deal. And you just go along with it and you get a little of your stuff, I get a little of my stuff. That's the compromise, particularly because I know that some of that stuff really, really does well. I'm not going to sit here and ignore the reality that they're running a business and I am benefiting from the ability to be on this platform and to say what I want to say, it. But then there's the give and take. What was so frustrating for me in particular was that the things that are of interest to me were frequently not the big ticket winners, right? Me covering some Starbucks labor dispute isn't necessarily going to get us, 200,000 views. But when it came to Israel-Palestine, for once, my kind of ideological interest happened to align where the audience's ideological interests were. And suddenly all the arguments that I had been confronted with about why we need to cover X, Y, and Z issue because it's good for business went out the window, and they seem to be working at cross purposes with their own economic agenda. And this went even further because there are, some other shows at the Hill that are less successful. This is no slight to anybody who's working there. I encourage those shows to keep working at it and trying to be successful, that's fine. But we were constantly being told that there were limited resources to hire staff that had been let go or who had left because how hard it was to work there with very little staff support, right? It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Mm-hmm.
People leave, you don't hire new staff. It becomes even more difficult for the old staff, the remaining staff, to keep up with content. They have higher expectations on them without higher pay. And so then they leave. And it was a cycle that was building over time. We were told we couldn't hire new staff at the same time that we saw other shows that weren't as successful just objectively and weren't bringing in the money being staffed up and resources being devoted to them in a way that didn't seem like it made very much sense. And what it always felt like to us was that because of the embarrassment around Rising, they were hoping that one of the more kind of typical staid news shows would become more successful and ultimately they would be justified in cutting ties with Rising. And I do wonder sometimes if they really even care about the success of the show, if they're secretly hoping that doing things like firing Katie, firing me, firing Kim will kill the show because then they have a justification for not just trashing what is so obviously a valuable property. And then one other point to the editorial control aspect of it. I was told when I joined the show that no matter what, the radars were sacrosanct, right?
Mm-hmm.
The video essays were sacrosanct. And in fact, about a year ago, I had agreed to go from 3 days a week to 4 if I didn't have to do radars because they're very time consuming. I said, fine, that's a fine trade-off. Yeah, that's a fine trade-off. But as they started trying to censor the Israel coverage, I went back to doing a lot of radars because I felt like that was the only way I could get more about what was going on in Gaza into the lineup every day, right? I didn't want to, but I felt frankly compelled to. At that point, I started getting pushback from the new producer as to what was even going into my radars. Mm-hmm. And that really became a tipping point in the source of a lot of behind the scenes arguing where it seemed like every single thing that happened on the show, off scene, not even to mention what was happening on screen with Robbie, was so contentious and so stressful that it made it very, very, very difficult to put on a show.
That's crazy. Yeah, I mean, I've heard very similar things, Briahna. It's not just about you. There's a lot of stuff I've been hearing from behind the scenes, like you just said, about censorship, about meddling, about some of the control. And I think, look, this could be tedious. It almost is inside baseball. But I think that people want to hear this because this is what's actually happening. This is why Krystal and I left, just by the way. But it's also, this is how every network news show operates. This is just more in the open because, Briahna, you are somebody who also has an alternative path. You can speak out about this without suffering genuine repercussions. So what does it feel like now, to be on the other side? Do you feel more liberated? Are you happier? And how are you thinking about the future?
I mean, I will say I am very lucky in the grand scheme of things, but it's also true that I got hit with hundreds of spam emails addressed to Patreon. They were sent to my bad faith account, I think unwittingly, but addressed to Patreon with this form letter begging Patreon to kick me off of the platform, right? And we have seen that kind of censorship from some of these kind of host platforms in the past, depending on what the ideological valence of the complaint is. So it is concerning that unless you're fully independent with your own infrastructure the way that you guys have, that there are still ways for people to attempt to try to de-platform you. I don't know if that's the right word in this context, but you're not entirely safe. I'd also say that, I sat down with Don Lemon at some point last week, and he revealed in the course of that interview that he's had other people from, I guess CNN, the mainstream milieu where he operated for so many years, reach out and tell him that they've never felt more constrained, they never felt more afraid about talking about an issue than they have about Israel-Palestine post-October 7th, and that they find themselves going over their segments afterward, wondering if they said the wrong thing and going through it with a fine-tooth comb because they're feeling at these legacy news outlets an incredible amount of pressure not to say something that's too critical of Israel. So to your point, Saagar, absolutely, this is par for the course for your average news outlet. And it's why I think genuinely independent outlets like yours are so important. But yes, I am very grateful to continue to be able to do what I've been doing for years long before Rising, which is my own podcast, my own show, Bad Faith. And I'm frankly looking forward to having a little bit more space to focus on the podcast and to also focus on writing and some other more creative things that have sat by the wayside because Rising was just so time consuming.
Good.
I have zero doubt you're going to continue to be phenomenally successful. I know you're probably going to be way happier too if our experience is any guide. So you may look back at this and say, you know what, in the end, this is the best thing that ever happened to me. But, we've followed and you follow all of these stories of censorship across the country. I mean, it does really seem like this is the number one issue on which cancel culture, censorship, deplatforming is the greatest threat, not to mention all of these bills and resolutions that are passing through Congress to effectively codify and embrace that censorship on both sides of the aisle. I'm sure you also saw this Israeli Holocaust scholar who is now, Raz Siegel, is now being denied his position because he was critical and is calling Israel's assault on Gaza a genocide, which, by the way, the ICJ is investigating. Numerous other scholars have called it that as well. It is, in fact, the majority position of Biden voters that what Israel is doing in Gaza constitutes a genocide. So in some ways, even though you're going to be fine because you have a platform, you're phenomenally talented, we're going to make sure, to support you in all the ways we can as well. There are going to be a lot of other people out there who are perhaps more junior in their career, perhaps don't have that established platform, and self-censor because they see what happened to you. They see what happens to these professors, Mehdi Hassan, other media personalities, Katie Halper, who have paid a cost for being outspoken on this specific issue.
Yes, and Mark Lamont Hill years ago. I mean, what's ironic is this has been going on for a really long time. All we're seeing is a kind of exponential examples, exponential growth in the number of examples that have come out since October 7th. And I think in some ways, the crackdown is opening up the eyes of a lot of people who really didn't realize how much of a red line this issue is. Biden doesn't have a red line, but talking about this in American politics is absolutely a red line. And I think it's frankly having a radicalizing effect that is going in the opposite direction of the Hasbara, which is to say, I mean, as much as Robbie and I debated this, I mean, what is Robbie to take away from the idea that this is the issue that ultimately got me forced off the show? Mm-hmm. Does that change your perspective as someone who has defended Israel about the incongruity of Israel's position that it's a democracy and that it respects free speech and it's the only democracy in the Middle East, to see the allied kind of social media forces, the reporting about the Israeli government branch that has officially launched this propaganda campaign to influence U.S. lawmakers and to create a culture online that being critical of Israel is bad for business. I mean, how can that not influence you to be increasingly critical of Israel going forward and increasingly skeptical of why it is that all of that is necessary to continue to have the dominance and influence that they've had in American politics for generations?
Well, Bri, tell people where they can follow you and how they can support you, and any ideas. You're going to continue, obviously, working on the podcast and building that out. Any other projects that you've got in the works you want to cue people
I don't want to commit to anything just yet.
Okay, that's fair.
Because I don't want to, my mouth to precede my actual ability to double down and make the content that I have planned. But you can follow everything that I'll be doing. I'll be announcing new stuff on my podcast. You can watch free episodes on YouTube at Bad Faith YouTube, and you can subscribe at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast to get an additional episode. I drop on Mondays. Today is an episode with Jeffrey Sachs, which is very good and I highly recommend. And free clips of the premium Patreon episodes are also put on Bad Faith YouTube. So be sure to go there and subscribe and follow the channel so you can get those as well.
Excellent.
All right, there you go,
links
guys.
To that in the description. So there you go.
Thank you, guys.
Briahna, it's so great to see you. And as I said, I know you're going to do well. And I'm excited for this next chapter for you.
Thank you both. I really appreciate it. Always a pleasure.
Our pleasure.
Hey, if you like that video, hit the like button or leave a comment below. It really helps get the show to more people.
And if you'd like to get the full show ad-free and in your inbox every morning, you can sign up at breakingpoints.com.
That's right. Get the full show, help support the future of independent media at breakingpoints.com.